In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of all the popular AWS services and how can we use those services to build a production application. So first, let's take a look at AWS Global Data Centers. So for AWS Global Data Centers, currently we have 77 availability zones for AWS, and availability zones basically is a isolated data centers within a region. And a region is basically a geographic area that contains at least 2 availability zones. So 2 to 3 currently for the availability zones. And here you can see we have a region called Ireland. And in this current region, we have 3 availability zones. So we have a West 1A and a West 1B and a West 1C. And the reason why we have multiple availability zone in one region is that there could be a situation where we have natural disaster, right? For example, earthquake or network issue or something like that. So maybe one availability zone is currently not available, right? So we can still rely on the other or the remaining availability zones to support the current application that we're running. So in this case, we're currently having 77 availability zones throughout the world and 24 geographic regions. It has announced that there are going to be 18 more availability zones and 6 more availability AWS regions coming very, very soon. So here you can see for the blue ones are the regions, and the orange ones are the ones that are coming very, very soon. So if we were to click on the blue one, you can see that there are currently 25 availability zones within North America and 6 geographic regions and 44 edge network locations. So edge network location is basically a place where they cache results, where they cache the data, right, in their local area. So let's say a user wants to frequently get a video, right, maybe a video that is frequently watched in this location. We can basically just cache that data in the edge location instead of users are sending requests to the region, right, to the availability zones to always fetch the data. We can be able to use edge locations to cache the result, which we will get into talk about the edge locations and how we can use those things when we build in an application. So first service that we want to talk about is the account service. And for the account service that we have once we create an AWS account, we can be able to use IAM, which is Identity and Access Management. So this service basically allows us to manage the access control for all the services that we can have in the AWS, which we will talk about what is IAM once we get into the security section. And basically for the AWS account, you can access to all the regions in the world, right? You can build you can launch an instance to pretty much everywhere in the world, right? You can, in this case, each region has at least 2 to 3 availability zones, right? At least 2 availability zones. So in this case, we can be able to, for each availability zone or AZs, we can be able to launch a virtual AWS account. We can also control the billing, right? And AWS services categories. So we also have a wide range of categories for the AWS services. So we have a wide range of AWS service categories. So here you can see we have analytics, game technology, blockchain, and machine learning, VR, front-end mobile application, compute, right, lambdas, and so on, right? So we have multiple categories for AWS. So AWS is not just only like deploying and launching your web application to a cloud, but there's also many other services that you can use in AWS. So let's take a look at how we can build or design a social media application with AWS services. But first, I want to talk about what is it like to build an application without AWS services. So usually when we don't use AWS services, when we build an application, we first usually have a secure private network, right, for security reason. And once we have a secure network, what we're going to do is we're going to add a load balancer, right? We first add load balancers to distribute the request, right? When users send requests to the application to fetch data or make changes, we usually have a load balancers to handle those requests and equally distribute those requests to the servers that we have, right? So we usually first have a web server, which is a client side or AWS controllers that handles those requests, right? And then we also going to have a app server, which handles the business logic and be able to interact with the database, right? So here you can see we have the web AWS, sorry, not AWS, the app server, right? The app server basically interact with the database. We usually have SQL database, or we can also have NoSQL, but in this case we have both, right? So there could be a situation where we want to get the social connections using a graph database, right, or a NoSQL database to understand the current user's social connections, right? Who is this person interact with, or the connections that this person has. And then we also have SQL, which stores the user's data or the application's data. And we also probably need a database caching, right? A database caching tool that basically cache the frequently requested data onto the database cache so that we can be able to improve the performance and have low latency for the data querying, right? So data fetching. And we also could have SMS, right? So when we usually when user maybe want to verify this user, or notify this user, we maybe send a SMS notification or email notification, right? We also could have that too. And we can also have a monitoring, where we want to monitor the current application, what is it doing, and is there any crashes or anything, right? So we want to know how many users are using this application and so on, right? And we can also have a content filter, right, for social media application when user upload a media file, right, a media, either a picture, video, anything. We basically do a content filter, right, make sure that there is no inappropriate or any media file that violates the rule, and then we just going to upload it to the external storage, right? So this external storage basically store all the media files, and when user want to fetch those data, right, when user want to be able to see the data that the other user posted, right, they can also have something called content delivery network, which basically cache data in all geographics. So they can just send a request to this local cache data center and then be able to get the data, the media files that they want from there. So this will basically improve the performance, right, by caching the data, by caching the files in their geographic locations. And we could also have a clickstream analysis, basically analyze the users in the application, and we usually analyze those things and then use like something called Hadoop or Spark to analyze those data, or sorting the data or query the data, right? And then we will basically store the data in a data warehouse, so that inside this warehouse we can be able to use business intelligence, right? We can use business intelligence to analyze, to predict the data according to the data warehouse. So this is basically like what is it like for if we don't use AWS services, right? So if we were not to use AWS services to build an application, you can see that we have to consider a lot of things, right? We have to consider how we can maintain servers, how we can be able to scale the servers, and how many servers we need, and so on and so forth, right? So we have to think about how can we manage those systems and so on. So if we were to replace those services, if we were to replace these things with AWS services, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to replace it with VPC, which is a virtual private network, right? Which is very similar to the secure private network, which will give us a private, virtual private network for the entire applications. And we can also have virtual private network for each and every single sections. So we have something called EC2, basically runs our application code on a virtual machine. So it will replace those servers that we have here, and then with EC2. And then EC2 has something called Elastic Block Storage, which is called EBS, which is designed for block storage service for EC2s. And we also have something called RDS. So Amazon RDS is basically a relational database. And we also have Amazon DynamoDB, which is a NoSQL database. And we also have something called AWS Elasticache, which basically cache the database, right? So we have our most visited data or most visited queries, and we want to store those data. In a cache, which we use something called Elasticache to store those frequently visited data, right? So that we don't have to. We basically improve the latency for querying data. And we also have Elastic Load Balancer, basically handles all the requests and then be able to distribute the requests to the servers, to all the servers that we have, or all the EC2s that we have. And the Route 53 basically gave us a domain name for users to route to the load balancer, right? And we also have S3, which is a external storage that basically store the media files and so on. And we also have Recognition, basically do the content filtering to make sure that we're not violating any rules or anything when user uploading the data to S3. And let's say we want to do some processing for S3, right? Data that we have or the files that we have in S3, let's say we want to turn the Excel file to a JSON file, or every time when a user upload a media file like an image or a video, we want to do a compression or compress the file or anything like that, right? So we want to do some code. We basically this Lambda service basically takes the code that we wrote, right? And then we basically just going to when an event is triggered, right? So it's basically a piece of code in the cloud that when an event is triggered, for example, when a user upload a file, we'd run that piece of code, and then it will output a result, and then it will output the change that we did, right? The result file. Then we're just going to store that in another S3, right? So, and then we also have something called Amazon Kinesis data analytics, basically analyze the data from the user, from the clickstream analysis, right? And we also have something called EMR, which basically is a way to replace Hadoop. And we also have Redshift, is the data warehouse, and QuickSight is the BI, which is a business intelligence tool for making data predictions and data analysis and stuff for the business use. And we also have something called CloudFront to basically replace the content delivery network, which basically cache data in all the geographics. We use something called CloudFront. And for database, so I should say the dashboard, right? The monitoring, we want to monitor the current infrastructure's status, right? The current all the services status. We also have something called CloudWatch, basically check the performance and see if there's anything crashes or anything like that. We use something called CloudWatch, basically monitoring the current status of the infrastructure. And we also have SNS, basically sends cell phone or like phone notifications to users, and as well as SES, which sends email notifications to users. So now you know how we can build an infrastructure using Amazon Web Services. Let's take a look at how some of the most important AWS application services. So one of them is API Gateway, which basically sits between the client and all the backend services, right? We can have multiple backend microservices. For example, we can have a cart microservices, a catalog, a user profile, a search, or many more, right? So we can have many backend microservices. So what we need is an API gateway which sits between the client and all the backend microservices, so that when a client sends a request to the application, it goes through the API gateway, and API gateway will know which direction to direct the request to, right? So in this case, if a user want to fetch how many items does this current person has in the cart, it will go through the API gateway, and API gateway knows that basically pass the request to the cart service, right? Cart microservice, fetch the data, returns back to the API gateway, and then it returns back to the clients. So in the real world, usually we have a load balancer basically handles requests and equally distributed to many API gateways, right? Because if we only have one API gateway, that could have a bottleneck. So it's not going to be good. So we can have multiple API gateway and then takes the requests, right? Handles the requests and then be able to pass down to the correct microservice to handle those requests. So that's why we have something called Amazon API gateway, right? So we also have something called Amazon Cognito, which basically uses third-party and identity providers to control the access control for the current applications. For example, we can have a Facebook login, Facebook sign up, login with Google, so that user don't have to like remember their email and password, so that they can just go through the third-party identity providers to log into the application. Right, so let's take a look at some of the AWS security services. So one of them that I talked about earlier is the identity and access management. So basically it allows the user to control who can access the application, database, all the AWS services, or the EC2s, storages, and so on, right? So we basically know what kind of, we want to determine set rules for what kind of action they can perform and who can allow to access to those applications. So this is what the identity and access management tool or the service that AWS provides. And we also have something called Certificate Manager. Basically, it's a service that allows users to manage the SSL, TLS certificates for the use with AWS services, and the internal connected resources such as Elastic Load Balancers, CloudFront, and so on. So it basically builds this secure connections, right? And we also have something called Application Firewall. So it basically pretty straightforward. So it protects the web application from attacks. So usually we put them in the CloudFront, load balancers, API gateways to prevent the attacks, right? And we also have something called Inspector. Basically runs multiple security assessments on the virtual machines to identify the security risks. So let's take a look at the development or the DevOps side for the AWS services, right? So let's say we're developers, we want to make changes to our current code base. We can use something called code commit, and basically commits the code using version control to push or save our code in a repository, and we can go back to a previous version and so on, right? So, and then what we can do is we can be able to push the code. We can be able to build the code, and this code build AWS services basically runs multiple tests, right, to build our application to make sure that the current changes that we made pass all the tests, and then we're ready to deploy, right? So once we are done that stage, we can move on to the code deploy, which basically deploys the code to all the instances, right? So in this case, we can also automate this process using a AWS code pipeline. We can use something called CloudFormation, which this CloudFormation builds our infrastructure, right? We basically use a JSON, right? JSON file to set up the rules, set up how we want to build our infrastructure, and this CloudFormation basically builds our infrastructure, right? This social media application, the infrastructure of the application, and then we can be able to use version controls to manage and go back to the previous version of our infrastructure, right? So we can be able to use CloudFormation to perform that, to build our infrastructure, and be able to manage the infrastructure that we currently have. So this is basically the overview of all the services that AWS has, and of course there are a lot more services that AWS that we didn't really cover, but those are the most important things if we want to focus on development and building applications, and this is just the basic layer of all the services that we have in AWS. So let's take a look at the AWS development and DevOps services. So let's say we're developers and we want to make changes to our current application. we can push the changes to something called AWS code commit, which is going to be a version control, which is similar to Git, which basically keep track of the changes that we made as well as the current code base. And once we've done that, we can be able to run tests, right? We can be able to use something called code build, which is going to build our code and run multiple tests to make sure that the changes that we make in our code pass all the tests. And then we can be able to move on to the deployment stage, right? We're getting the code ready to deploy, right? So then we have something called code deploy, basically deploy our code, our application onto those instances, right? So EC2s. And then we can also automate this process called, use something called code pipeline, right? We can be able to automate this process, right? And we can also have something called cloud formation. Basically, we wrote the instruction on how we want to build the infrastructure in a JSON file, and we pass it on to the cloud formation, and the cloud formation will build this infrastructure. And we can also use cloud formation to manage the infrastructure that we currently have. And the other thing that we can do for cloud formation is that we can be able to use version controls to keep track of the previous version of the infrastructure that we have. So this is basically the overview of all the AWS services. Of course, there are a lot more services that we didn't cover. I just really cover them briefly. So there you have it, and thank you for watching.